Erev Tov, everybody. We are concluding Sefer Shemot, concluding our segment with Rav Shai Held and Heart of Torah. We will be returning to Nechama Leibowitz for Vayikra. Looking forward to that. And there's some continuities between this essay of Rav Shai's and the end of Shemot, and where we started with him last year in Vayikra. So we'll see some of that. And as has been true, I think, of some of the recent essays, a little bit shorter and tighter towards the end of Shemot, and leaving more time for discussion as is possible. Let me share my screen and we will begin. Pekudei number 2, building a home for God. After reporting on all that had been done in erecting the Mishkan, the Torah declares, Moshe saw, Vayar, all the tasks, Kol HaMelacha, and behold, Vihine, they had done it, Asu, Suota. As the Lord had commanded, so had they done, and Moshe blessed them. To the attentive reader, the links to the creation story are unmistakable. And God saw, Vayar, all, Kol, that God had done, Asa, Vihine, and behold, it was very good. That's from the end of Breshit chapter 1, the end of the 6 days of creation. In the one case, God looks and sees, while in the other, Moshe does. In both cases, everything has been completed just as God wants. There seems to be a deep connection between God's creation of the world on the one hand and the Israelites' construction of the Mishkan on the other. But just what is that connection and what is it intended to suggest? The literary links between creation and the Mishkan are both abundant and striking. Immediately after God looks and sees that the world is good, Genesis tells us, right, the following pasuk from where we left off, that the heaven and earth were finished by Chulu Hashemayim va'aretz. Similarly, when the Mishkan is completed, Exodus says that all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was finished, Vatechel. In the creation story, we learn that on the seventh day, God finished Vayechal, God's work, Melachto, which God had done. In the story of the Mishkan, we discover that Moshe finished Vayechal, all the work, Hamelacha. After God evaluates the world, we are informed that God blessed Vayevarech, the seventh day. After Moshe sees that the Mishkan has been built according to plan, we hear that Moshe blessed Vayevarech, the Israelites. In Exodus, there are 6 days of preparation for receiving God's revelation, and God's instructions are given to Moshe on the 7th day. Right, this is Mishpatim's, the end of Parashat Mishpatim's account of Revelation, where there's 6 days of preparation, and then God reveals God's self and speaks to Moshe on day 7. These instructions are presented in 7 distinct divine speeches, each of which begins with the Lord spoke, Vaydaber, or the Lord said, Vayomer. And here we have the distinct sections indicated for us. These 7 speeches mirror Genesis's description of God's utilization of speech to create the world in 7 days. Right? The slight differentiation here is that the sages talk about the world being created with 10 utterances. So the actual accounts of speech may be 10, but there are 7 in this version, 7 speech acts, which mirror the 7 days. The 7 days are more than 7 speech acts. So the 7 speeches mirror Genesis's description of God's utilization of speech to create the world in 7 days. The 7th and final speech, here again talking about in Shemot, enjoins the Israelites to keep Shabbat, just as the 7th day of creation introduces the 7th day as God's day of rest. Lest we miss the point, this 7th divine communication, again here we're talking in Shemot, concludes The Shabbat shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day God ceased from work and was refreshed. The instructions for the construction of the Mishkan thus not only allude to God's creation of the world, but also explicitly culminate by invoking it. Generally speaking, I'll just say as an aside, I think this last part, this paragraph, is a kind of lesser known parallel, right? The parallels in semantics, in word choice, are more apparent. It's a little subtler to notice these 7 distinct speeches in Shemot, which mirror the 7 days of creation. But there are even more literary connections. Exodus describes Bezalel, the Mishkan's chief craftsman, as endowed with a divine spirit, Ruach Elokim. That Hebrew phrase, Ruach Elokim, has occurred only twice before in the Torah. Just as God is about to begin creating the world, Genesis tells us that a divine spirit, Ruach Elokim, was sweeping over the water. By now, I trust the point is clear, says Rav Shai. The Torah wants us to know that God's creation of the world and Israel's construction of the Mishkan are intertwined in a highly significant way. To return to where we started, precisely how and why are world creation and Mishkan construction so intimately connected? On one level, the implication of the coupling of the construction of the Mishkan and the creation of the world is that the Mishkan is intended to serve as a microcosm, a world in miniature. To understand what this means, we ought to consider one more literary link between Mishkan in Exodus and creation in Genesis. The final chapter of Exodus contains 7 instances of the expression, just as the Lord had commanded Moshe, which serves a similar function to the 7-fold repetition of the phrase, and God saw that it was good in Genesis. Bible scholar John Levinson, who's the most sort of significant developer of this concept that Rav Shai leans on here, helpfully draws out the relationship. Let's see if we can get this to show up a little better. Hold on. There we go. Between the 2 repeating formulas. The theological substance of the 2 similar refrains is a pointed insistence upon the correspondence of the object constructed with the intentions of God. The Mishkan and the world both result from the perfect realization of divine commandments, and nothing that God has commanded falls short of God's expectations. The Mishkan, like the world, is a perfect realization of God's plans, right? So going back for a moment to the question of how and why are world creation and Mishkan construction so intimately connected, the first point is that the Mishkan is a world in miniature, and it mirrors the world in its perfection of correspondence between command and execution. So God saw that everything was good, meaning created in accordance with God's will, and the Israelites or Moshe's construction of the Mishkan is precisely as God commanded it. Except that in reality, and according to the Torah itself, the world as we find it falls far short of God's hopes and expectations. And by the way, there are some interesting little hints to this also in the creation story. The one that stands out most immediately to me is the point that the Midrash makes in that God commands eitz peri ose peri, fruit trees that produce fruit, and that's what God says should be made. And when we see the actual object described in the Torah following, it's eitz ose peri, a tree which bears fruit. And the Midrash comments that God's original vision was tam eitzo upirio shaveh, that the tree itself was supposed to taste the same as the fruit. So if you grabbed a piece of bark off of an apple tree, it was supposed to have tasted like apple. But the earth somehow did not follow God's instructions. a fascinating midrashic idea with a lot that's developed extensively. But so we already see little developments in the midrash of this idea that even built into creation was somehow a not perfect carrying out of God's instructions. And now Rav Shai is going to say this much more broadly. In reality, and according to the Torah itself, the world as we find it falls far short of God's hopes and expectations. Instead of a world in which human dignity is real, we live in a world in which barbarism and cruelty all too often rule the day, in which unspeakable suffering pervades every corner of the globe, and in which all talk of human dignity can thus sound like so much Pollyanna nonsense. Instead of a world in which God's presence is manifest and almost tangible, we live in a world in which God all too often seems utterly absent. So much so that talk of God can seem like little more than wishful fantasy. One way to think about the Torah, and for that matter about human history as a whole, is a story of divine disillusionment and disappointment. The best laid plans of God, too, often go awry. I mentioned another striking midrash or Rashi in my drasha a little over a week ago, where Rashi comments that when Moshe is given the instructions to prepare the second luchot, and God says about the giving there, "V'ish lo ya'aleh imach," no man should go up with you on the mountain. Rashi comments that the first luchot were given with great fanfare and noise and community, and as a result, shalta bahem ayin hara v'nishtabru. An evil eye somehow laid claim to them, and they were broken. It's kind of a remarkable point because God is the one who seems to instruct all of those things. And so again, you see this sort of notion of an initial vision of creation or covenant, and then it goes wrong. And here it's not even clear that that was humans' fault, just something about how God envisioned the occasion to go didn't go according to plan. In a world overrun by chaos, the Mishkan, I'd like to suggest, is intended to serve as one place in which everything unfolds according to the divine plan, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. In Levinson's apt formulation, the Mishkan is meant to be a world, an ordered, supportive, and obedient environment. Amid all the world's brokenness, then, there is to be one place at least in which God really is present and God's word really is authoritative. It is as if God says to Moshe and the Israelites, I made you a place to live. Now you make one for me. In fact, that's very much the language of the Midrash in talking about, going back to Parashat Tumah, make me a sanctuary and I will dwell amongst you or amongst them. The Midrash uses the language something like that Hashem bikesh dira batachtonim, some little residence down in the lower realm. And so we have that idea of I made you a place to live, now you make one for me. Great, Nathan, hang on one second. I think we are actually, yeah, let's pause for your comment, please.
This just hit me, sorry. The one place where God is truly authoritative, there's a concept called Ein Shvut Bamikdash.
Mm-hmm.
The Chachamim have set up Gzerot and rules that those rules don't apply in the Mikdash, and I never thought about why that would be. I just accepted it, but I wonder if that's part of it.
So that it sort of feels like a realm
Even Chachamim
exclusively ruled by
don't have
God.
rules. What?
That it
Right?
so
They
that
follow
it
God's
highlights
rules
the
without
sense,
adulterating.
yeah, that we only feel God's rule, not sort of the joint rule of God and God's agents, the sages. Yeah,
Right.
beautiful, fascinating, and lovely extension of this idea. Shkoach. Great. We'll continue on. But Judaism could never rest content with one small pocket of order and goodness in a world otherwise utterly adrift. If the correspondence between Mishkan and world is meant to suggest that the Mishkan is supposed to be a miniature world, it is equally supposed to remind us that the world is intended to be a very large tabernacle. That is, a place in which God's word is obeyed, God's presence felt, and God's dreams for the world fulfilled. Like the Mishkan, the world is supposed to be a place in which the reign of God is visible and unchallenged, God's holiness is palpable, unthreatened, and pervasive. Just as the Mishkan is a microcosm, so the world is, or is supposed to be, what Levinson calls a macro temple. Right? In a certain way, I would say, there's a strong strand of Jewish theology which would say something similar about the role that the Jewish people plays. Supposed to be a people in which, God's authority is manifest and, there is perfect obedience, and that is somehow supposed to be a model for the world in which not everyone, of course, is expected to keep the 613 commandments, but is supposed to somehow base themselves on the model of the Jewish people keeping their 613 for the rest of the world to keep their, however many. So this microcosm model for the rest of the world as well. So I think there's some correspondence in a sense between the way the Jewish people is envisioned in their covenantal relationship with God, and then the Mishkan as a sort of miniature kind of geographic religious space for that as well. Jewish theology often wrestles with the tragic sense that although God brought the world into being, it has run so totally amok that God's presence seems to be in exile. In a world so filled with callousness and inhumanity, so enamored of idols both insipid and insidious, where is there room for God? In a world so permeated by selfishness and indifference, where can the God who shatters our indifference and commands us to love the stranger dwell? As we read the 13 chapters in Exodus about the Mishkan, we are challenged to ask, how can I live my life in a way that makes space for God, not just in the forms and rituals of religion, which can so easily become shallow or corrupt, but also in the most fundamental ways I carry myself in the world? How can we, my community and the Jewish people as a whole, live in such a way as to let God in? I'd also just comment briefly, one of the last few years on Tisha B'Av night, our custom is to learn a midrash after Eicha. There's a powerful midrash based on, which appears in various forms across rabbinic literature, about the exile of the Shekhinah from the Beit HaMikdash, and that it was this sort of stepwise process in which, God constricted and constricted as, the Jewish people were becoming more and more, whatever we want to understand it, self-focused, unkind to each other, idol worshiping, whatever it was, that God's presence was constraining and constraining, constricting and constricting, and then sort of departing and departing. So it sort of plays on this idea as well. The Mishkan is supposed to be the place for God to dwell, and with our failing to make that room, God's presence shrinks and shrinks and departs and departs. For the religious person, what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes about prayer applies to life as a whole as well. God is in exile, the world is corrupt. The universe itself is not at home. To pray means to bring God back into the world, to establish God's kingship for a second at least. To pray means to expand God's presence. To worship, therefore, means to make God immanent, to make God present. God's being immanent in the world depends on us. The challenge before us, in other words, is to transform the idea that the world is a temple, a home for God's presence, from a pretty but potentially banal notion into a tangible reality and a life's project. Even in a world in which God seems so far, it is possible to create moments when God's presence is brought intimately near. I think in some way, the notion of Beit Knesset as a Mikdash Ma'at, of our synagogues as miniature versions of the temple or the Mishkan, some way is meant to replicate that idea, right? We try to bring our best selves. There are certain ways in which we maybe even sort of adhere to Jewish law a little bit more fastidiously inside shul. Or we have somehow different standards for our behavior. That's some of that is the laws of honoring the Beit Knesset, but those laws themselves are based on honoring the Mikdash, which itself somehow is based on a heightened awareness of being in God's presence, and so kind of there's some way in which shul is a place to try to act out our best selves, be in community with people different from us, sort of in a more limited time and space. Maybe we have the capacity in that smaller area to kind of practice or put on our best selves. And just like the challenge is to then expand the Mishkan or Mikdash out into the rest of the world and the rest of our lives. I think similarly, that's one way in which I think of shul as kind of the place for the best versions of ourselves, practicing building community in the most expansive and inclusive ways, and then challenging ourselves to bring that out with us into the rest of the world. So again, less textually complex, but seeing this basic comparison and developing it further from creation of the world to creation, construction, completion of the Mishkan, and then developing from there, what exactly is the nature of the relationship between them supposed to be, and taking it out to our lives. We'll go to Dad and then back to Nathan. Go ahead, Dad.
So there's another aspect of what Moshe is involved in constructing the Mishkan, duplicating God's creation of the world. Prior to this, Moshe in Egypt was involved in the destruction of an empire. He was really, in a way, destroying the world, reversing creation. If you look at the different plagues, animals are killed, plants are destroyed, darkness, there's no light, people are killed. I mean, it's a reversal of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the text in Pekudei, it seems to indicate that Moshe actually constructed the Mishkan himself.
Mm-hmm.
He did that work. And in a way, it's like a tikkun, a repair for the damage that he did to God's creation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So the particular right, you're adding sort of the element of thinking about what happened in between the creation of the world and the construction of the Mishkan, in particular for the Jewish people, was they bore witness to, and to a degree, specifically Moshe and Aaron were agents of a kind of a world undoing. And so in the construction of the Mishkan is not just, we should compare it or put it in the context not just of the creation of the world, but of the immediate past sort of world destruction that they experienced. And it helps us understand Moshe's role in particular, rebuilding after being an agent in some way of destruction. That's a powerful, beautiful thought. Thank you. Nathan, there you are.
Okay, so I think if I understood you correctly, you said that when we practice certain heightened religious practices in shul, we take the way we behave in shul more seriously than maybe we do outside of shul. And you said that the thought is, well, we're going to practice it in this room, and maybe the goal is to bring it out with us, right? It's not that we're fooling anybody by saying, in shul we act this way. Of course, outside we never would act this way. The idea is to practice it and then to bring it with us when we go out. So a lot of people ask, like during the Shulchan Aruch talks about during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, that you adopt certain practices, you don't adopt the rest of the rest of the year. And people say, well, who am I fooling? Right? I mean, so God's going to think, okay, so I changed the way I practice for these 10 days. He's going to forgive me, and then I'll go back to the way I was before, and I'll do that every year. So the goal is not necessarily what you're doing outside to make sure. The goal is like you said, take that practice. In the, not you talked about space, now his time, right? Take it, we're going to have a certain time where we practice a certain way. And if we do it right, it influences us and influences the way we behave the rest of the year too.
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates very
So
much.
that you don't necessarily say, I'm going to stop doing it, but maybe one day you will continue doing it,
Yes.
or continue doing other things, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Absolutely. I think in certain ways the whole structure of the Jewish year is built that way. The Chagim in certain ways are opportunities to experience different ideas or dimensions of our relationship with God in a more intensified way. The idea is then to take something of that dimension or that focus outward. You can't necessarily do it with that level of intensity all year round, but to always kind of carry a little resonance of that with us. Yeah.
when
Yeah.
people talk about Pesach also, chametz, right?
Yes.
The Zohar talks about chametz being maybe a food that we should stay away from. And everybody says, well, if that's the case, why are we only staying away from it for 7 or 8 days? And maybe it's aspirational. Maybe
Right.
it's like we'll take a little Pesach with us and bring it up to the rest of the year
Yeah.
if we do it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Other thoughts, any other dimensions of kind of like the structure of the Mishkan as a miniature world that, map onto creating the world that we want to have outside of the Mishkan or any other reactions? Yeah, I see David L.
Is it time for humor?
Yes, it is Adar after all.
So it's funny that on page 224, the last page of Rav Shai's essay, in the first full paragraph, he talks about a world that is so filled with callousness and inhumanity, and asks whether there's room for God. Based on everything he said before, I would think that the problem is the world is full with too much humanity and not enough divinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was meant as humor.
Yes. 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 Received as such. Received as such. Good.
I feel like he made a big jump between talking about the Mikdash as a small creation and what was the last paragraph about changing our behavior or trying to pull God into our everyday.
Mm-hmm.
I guess reading these sedras does not naturally lead me to think, oh, how can I be better in the world? Talking about hooks and clasps and curtains and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't
Yeah.
draw me there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think he's arguing from the right that's not on the surface in the description of the Mishkan. But it's only when we come to the end and we see the parallels sort of at the conclusion to the creation of the world that then we sort of go back and look at the whole thing in the context of the framework of a parallel to creating a world. And then we say, okay, well, what's this world that we're creating for? It's to create space for God to dwell amongst us. And gosh, that's, that's sort of the miniature version of what the world is supposed to be. So how do we then create that in the world at large? If the Mishkan is supposed to be an idealistic world, so how do we map that outwards? I think what at least what I'm in part taking away from what you're saying or asking is there anything like that's true about kind of the framework of the structure of telling about constructing the Mishkan, but is like how does the Shulchan teach us something about the world that God is supposed to inhabit? How does the Mizbeach, how do the curtains? And I think so the at the minimal level, the answer is nothing in particular, just that these were refined and specific and ordered, and were built in exactly the way they were supposed to. And so that shows us a vision of a world in which we really carry out God's wishes, and therefore it looks beautiful. I think the next level to apply it, although I agree with you, it's not obvious on the surface, I think Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch definitely does a lot of this, is to try to actually answer that question. What is the shulchan in our world? It's the way we make sure everybody has enough to eat. What is the menorah? It's the focus on illuminating and educating and ensuring everyone has access to knowledge. Like was Rabbi Sarah's drasha this past Shabbat. What is the entranceway? What is the masach? Is it a door that locks? Is it a screen that demarcates boundaries but still allows access? I think those are some of the questions. I agree with you. It's not apparent on the surface. You have to do a couple levels more of interpretation. Judith, yes. First of all, welcome. Great to have you. See if you can unmute yourself because we don't hear you yet. We don't hear you yet. Are you able to unmute?
Okay, it worked.
Yes.
Sorry. Maybe it's not about what the details are in the Mishkan, but the fact that there are details in the Mishkan. That in living life in the world, it's important to pay careful attention to everything you do, to try to make things beautiful, to do things thoughtfully. That's it.
Beautiful. Yeah, the fact that God didn't just say build a house and whatever it is will be fine, but said like there's precision and attention, and even if we don't know exactly what the reason is, we understand that. And
that's something we can bring into the world, that
yes.
Day-to-day living, to do that with care and specificity.
Yes, that the details matter.
Yeah.
Great. Back to you, Abadi. Go ahead.
I think this would maybe a little bit responsive to James also, but I can't tell you that I remember what he said. When Rabbi Saul Berman was here, he went through the Korbanot that we say in the morning, and he, challenged us to see how each one of those is a change in our attitude, and a change in our behavior, and a change in our soul. I think there's, some of those details in Rabbi Berman's hand were like, golden values. Like maybe you could do a better job of telling James what it was that Rabbi Berman said, because I can't remember. I heard it.
Yeah, I heard it. Yes, that resonates very much.
Yeah. So that was true of kind of and this is where Rav Shai goes in the Vayikra essay, the one that we did for Parashat Vayikra, about kind of the service in the Mishkan also being indicative of kind of these details and values being lived out in the Mishkan as a model for how they would be lived out in the world at large. Yeah. Great.
I have a thought or a kind of a question.
Please, Peter.
Mishkan was located in a desert. It was centered in the middle of Shvotim. Now, and over the next 500 years was in various locations, as you pointed out last week. Now, then we built the first and second temple at a very specific location. Now, why can't we build the third temple like the Mishkan in our own slightly different location of our own choosing? What's preventing us from rebuilding the third temple somewhere slightly different elsewhere from where it was, where that place is not attainable right now politically? Can you put out the word and we start building, Rabbi?
How would we agree on the location, Peter?
Right. We could agree on the location. I mean, but the location was not that specific for Mishkan, right? Because stayed in many locations, a number, I don't know how many, but a number of locations. Why are we just, I know the reason, the location of the first and second temple, but couldn't we just go forward on the third temple at a different appropriate location? I don't know, just occurred to me
Oh,
because of the
it's a fascinating question. You know, I guess let me try to offer a couple of answers. One is, I think at a sort of technical halachic level, our prevailing understanding, and of course we could query why is this the case, but our prevailing understanding is there's a lot of discussion in the Gemara about the status of the place where the temple was built, and I think our general understanding is, you know, kedusha rishona kidsha l'sha'ata v'kidsha la'atid lavo, that once the place where even the first temple was built kind of was endowed with that sanctity remained, and sort of is irrevocable from that location. Now, I guess that doesn't preclude the possibility that sanctity could be generated in another location, but I think this sort of understanding is when we made that
must
shift
be, yeah,
from temporary to permanent, then that permanent location became the permanent location. Whether the temple was standing or not, it sort of became consecrated as the place where the temple would need to be whenever it would stand.
right.
And I think, but what I sort of take, I guess, a further reaction to your comment is, if we accept you know, we now live in a world in which we have profoundly decentralized worship, you know, very much back to, you know, not just the mobile Mishkan, but the fact that prior to the construction of the temple, it was also permissible to have various kinds of local sanctuaries. When the Beit HaMikdash was built, those became
Yes,
prohibited. I feel like a different version of your question might be, why in the when it is the case that we are not able to have a temple for whatever reason, why should we not be able to have decentralized worship? And in some sense, I think we do. In the absence of the Beit HaMikdash, we have our
we do, yeah,
individual shuls. And it sort of feels like now we have this sort of binary model where when there is no temple, then we pray in our local precincts. If we were to go back to a temple, you know, it would need to be in its designated precinct. But I still think it's a
right, yeah.
question to consider. Thank
So
you.
there are possibilities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bracha, go ahead.
As I'm thinking about the Mishkan and everything about it, I'm thinking there's a consciousness that's being built, and it's one of service, because from the construction of the Mishkan, you know, the design of it by Bezalel and the people working with him, from the donations that everyone gave to the Mishkan, from the whole purpose of having a Mishkan and for connecting with God and for being in community together doing that. And you know, I just get a sense that there's a background murmur that's saying be of service. You know, don't just be here, but be of service. And adding what was mentioned just recently by you or someone in relation to the movement of the Mishkan from place to place, that's also engaging us in having movement in our lives and not just being set in one idea or one way of doing things, but that actual fluidity of movement, of adjusting and trying it a different way and things like that. So I'm getting this whole consciousness of service and growth potential in all of that.
Beautiful. I love both of those ideas. Which the truth is, Rav Shai didn't really delve into that dimension. We sort of spoke about it as a place of carrying out God's values or vision, but particularly the notion, of the Beit HaMikdash as a place of avodah, of worship, which is really around service. He didn't emphasize as much, and I think that's a beautiful idea. And then as well, this notion of kind of fluidity or change is also really, really interesting. Great. Other thoughts? So I see James pop something into the chat. Right. If the creation vision failed, why will the Mishkan Shul vision succeed? I think it may be destined to be imperfect, and the striving is our task. I don't know if we would think of it as success or failure as much as may never achieve its goals, but should not prevent us from trying to achieve its goals. I guess that's what I would say. Judith, yeah?
Did you say the creation vision failed or that it changed?
Failed or changed, right. I mean, you're right. And there's even, I think if we take the rabbinic understanding that God created and then destroyed a bunch of worlds. So the first iteration was more of a sense of failure, and now it's more of a sense of still work in progress.
One of the things I was thinking when we were talking about the creation and the trees that were supposed to taste like apples but didn't, or whatever, any act of creation that human beings do, you don't quite know where it's going to go until you're in it. Like if I write something, I think I know what I want to write, but then when the words flow, it comes out different. Why would God's creation necessarily be a different process?
Right. We could surmise that it would be because God is different, but we could also surmise that it would not be because we are made in the image of God. So there's some kind of correspondence potentially there. That's a great thought. Thank you. Nathan, back to you.
Okay, I think that, and this I forgot which of the Farshim talk about this, probably more than one, but that the Torah itself shows trial and error, where God starts with Adam, that doesn't work. He goes to Noah and his family, and that doesn't work. He goes to Avram and his family, and then presumably the exile was to try to get Avram's family to do better. So I think, James, you're right. Why do we think it's going to work? But God's whole point is, I created man because I want man to strive to be like me. And we're going to keep giving you chances to figure it out and try to do it. I mean, even Rav Shai said, God in exile is a way. We need to pray in order to bring him back. So I think Rav Shai is conscious of James's quandary, but I think that's if the message from the Torah is not, we're never going to succeed, the message from the Torah is keep trying until you get it right.
Yeah. Beautiful. Any essay which sort of sparks thought about the world is a fruitful one. So it's great to kind of use the Mishkan as a springboard to think about, what is the world? What is its vision? How are we doing? So thank you to all. I'm wondering if Lance wants to add anything. We usually get a chance to hear from you, Lance. So just giving you an opportunity before we say goodnight.
The only thing I can say is, to quote Samuel Johnson in Rasselas, human life is everywhere a state in which much is to be endured and very little to be enjoyed. That's really Kohelet.
Yes, it is. And gives us a glimpse of the challenges that we have in this world, as Rav Shai very, forthrightly laid out. So may we keep doing the work together, keep working towards more and more of a world that looks in some way like the Mishkan, and we're always trying to do that in the Bayit as well. So thanks to all for being part of it, and look forward to continuing as we make our way next week to Nechama Leibowitz for Vayikra. Thanks to all. What a great group, great discussion. Laila Tov. Love to
Thank you, Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.